This is going to be a really difficult one for me, partly because it's not exactly a charged topic, but it's one that is obviously at its root political. And it's one that I've kind of been aware of, and it hasn't quite been articulated by other people to my knowledge. So it's kind of a most things kind of boil down to one core something or other when I start thinking about it. And it's something that I haven't really gone through properly. So this is, as everything, quite rough. And it's not related to now, but it can be applied broadly to anything ever. It doesn't have to even be necessarily political. So I want to first set the groundwork, which is who you are is not who you will be. Who you were is not who you are. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you improve, but it does mean that you change. Now, part of that is you have performed actions with that self in mind in the past, and you are doing the same now, and you will do the same later. And the more, let's say, the more influential those actions are, is I'm going to try it from a different angle. Let's say that in the past you were extremely active and you had a perspective. You had a perspective and you were extremely active and you performed actions in the world and they had real effect. Okay? Time passes and now it's today. And today you are not who you were. Today it isn't just you're not who you were, you are not just different, but you have a perspective that would have been antagonistic to your youthful self. So your past self and your present self wouldn't have gotten along. And that means that your past self, being active with those perspectives in mind, your current self will think of those actions as being damaging in the world. Now, in the most kind of clear-cut sense, you made mistakes. You made mistakes and you acted on them and they rippled out into the world. And now there's no mechanism. Okay, most people won't admit when that happens. Now, just like in conversation, most people won't admit when they're wrong, partly because it's embarrassment, partly because it's public embarrassment, but it's also kind of a private thing. And there are techniques in conversation where it is understood that it's not exactly an opponent in conversation, but when another person has a very, let's say, closed mind, you can't get through and make a change then and there in conversation. Normally what happens is you end up kind of agreeing to disagree, and that person who is maybe objectively wrong goes off, thinks about what they've been taught, and kind of changes their mind in private. Maybe there are problems of like cult-like reinforcement where they have friends that are of the incorrect perspective, and now that person has to be like essentially oppressed in their circle of friends by they know the truth, but they live in a crowd of people who don't, and they're too scared of being bullied and ostracized when trying to challenge because they don't have the tools to actually properly deconvert in the way that it happened to them. So people will quietly change their mind kind of in the dark. And often that will happen as, let's just roughly call it, in our hypothetical situation, you grew up. Your past self didn't know any better, but based on the informed consent that was valid at the time, those were good decisions. Those were good actions. The good, not exactly capital G good, but it was well meaning, it was well intentioned. But now you know better. Now you know better, and now you regret who you were, what you did. Quietly, privately, after the fact, you untangle things. You figure things out. You get yourself straight. You don't have that cult anymore. You don't have those friends anymore. You detoxed yourself from all those poisonous people, from all those flawed ideas. And let's just, again, make it simple. Those fundamental errors. So, sorry, hopefully you don't hear me just knocking on my mic. Let's say fundamental, objective untruths in the past, and now objective truths, to make it clean cut, because life's not that simple, of course. Okay, now because your past self performed actions in the world, and they're wrong, now you discover that they're actually objectively wrong, but your past self acted in the world. Now, it isn't good enough that you quietly, in the dark, changed your perspective, fixed yourself. That isn't enough, because back then your past self did damage to the world. Did damage to the world by acting on all of those falsehoods, and part of the cult, unbeknownst to your past self, you were part of the problem, oppressing your circle of friends. Who knows how many of your other friends all knew you were all living a lie. Maybe 100% of you all understood that. And this is actually a thing in the dark of politics, where you've got a whole bunch of people that don't trust one another, that don't know who's going to tattle on who. And so each one of them knows that they're living a lie and they're playing pretend, and they're all kind of circling, wondering if one another actually understands the lie that they're all playing with. Maybe that's what your childhood was, and because you weren't brave enough, you didn't do anything. You didn't do anything about it. And back then, so you were influencing other people negatively, and you were influencing the world, perhaps people you didn't necessarily meet, perhaps things you did in the world, perhaps, I don't necessarily have to say activism, but that's what comes to mind. And now it isn't enough that you have changed, that you're not doing that anymore. You're not making that mistake anymore. Good. Okay, good. That's a start. But you haven't undone the damage. And the idea of undoing that damage is something akin to incredible embarrassment. It's like apologizing is sometimes harder than just stopping. Like you want to just kind of like put it all off, put it in the past, water in the bridge kind of thing. Like you did a bunch of stupid stuff, you stop it, you're done, you move on. That's not good enough if you've damaged lives. So, for example, I'm not too familiar with it, but Alcoholics Anonymous has, one of the notions is finding all the people that you wronged while being an alcoholic and apologizing. And I can't imagine how essentially humiliating that is. And a person has to be in a certain kind of place before they can even do that. And that's an extraordinarily, let's say that's an extraordinarily adult thing to do. But that's not quite a good way of saying it. because that is a fine, heroic example of an adult that not many of us can aspire to be like that. And imagine the person who has a regretful childhood now has to face the idea of the embarrassment of admitting they were wrong in public and doing things. And if they're, let's say it was last year, so it was recent, it was last year that they regret. Now they know better. It's one thing to stop in the dark. It's another thing to admit it. It's another thing to try to fight against it when it is active, because it was a year ago. Maybe there are other people who are still active in that perspective. Maybe it's, friends at the time, but now they're what would you call, like, roughly intellectual opponents, something like that. And so now you have to go deconvert them. Now you have to go and deconvert them and do something to undo the damage, not just by changing other people's minds. I want to give an example, and this is part of the problem of this as a thought experiment, trying to understand this idea, is this doesn't happen in the world. We don't see it in the world. And the only examples I have is from a theistic and atheistic perspective. And even that is wrong. That is not a good way of talking about it. It's not a good way of thinking about it, because often somebody who starts off theistically in life regrets it later. They see the truth from their perspective, and then they become religiously atheistic. They become anti-theistic, and they have all the arguments, and so they go from the faith-based experience of thinking about things to a reasoning-based process, and then they want to pit them against one another and say, okay, well, reasoning, because this talks about all kinds of facts, we reason through all that, we actually look for evidence and all this kind of stuff. Obviously this stuff's false, and it's important to fight against the falseness in that. Like that is one of the anti-theistic actions that happens in that undoing, that damage undoing process. So one of the and that honestly, that's the only example that comes to mind. Maybe it's because so few people are brave enough to do that, or maybe it's because I want to say something hopeful, like maybe it's because there really aren't any good enough examples where that's necessary to do. But I kind of know that's wrong. And I'm going to bring up why. Okay, so the theism anti-theism thing, and it's absolutely fascinating what happens with, because I've followed the story arc that people will have from theism, from, let's say, cultist and extremist theism, very, very highly dogmatic, highly closed-minded, out to the exploration. And it's often as somebody's like 14 and they start like they get into enough of that rebellious state that they start questioning things and they go looking for things. And there's a phrase, the internet is where religion goes to die. And it's not wrong, but it's rather fascinating. So I've seen the story arc of people specifically on YouTube, where back in 2003, essentially, 2003, 2004 was the rise of new atheism. And there's a whole lot of people that were fighting specifically against creationism, which is a zealously incorrect view of the world, even using the the core honest version of the dogma that they adhere to. It is objectively wrong. Objectively wrong. And people who have been going through that arc, this is not necessarily creationist deconverting or anything like that, but in that climate there was a lot of people that were thinking and talking something like anti-theistically. And it's interesting when they go from being just entering into puberty, and over the years, because it's been quite a number of years since then, for me to see them doing the little I don't know what to do, I don't understand all these things, and finding encouragement in a community, and then being rebellious and then talking out and then making videos and getting a little popular and then fizzling out because you get a significant other or they get it to college or whatever the heck, and then at the end they just find some ideology. They traded some religion for some other thing. And I see the full story arc of their brain going from just going back to where they were again, just with some different names. And it's very strange. It's very strange. It's actually quite disheartening. But all through that, and again, I can't really think of very many examples. All through that, they're not doing anything to undo what they did, what they were like, who they were. They're not really going and deconverting their family or anything like that. They're kind of helping by talking a little bit about it, because often people will make videos and somebody will email them or whatnot and say like, this really helped me. I was thinking like this and this, but I mean, I didn't know about that. And a lot of YouTubers who will say that I don't like talking about this particular subject, but so I'm kind of citing other people talking about this, but it goes something like, this person isn't necessarily one of these motivational speaker type people. They're just, they're just themselves, and they're doing their stuff. And somebody will email them saying, I've been really depressed and I've been thinking of, and that video really helped me. And these content creators, now you would call them influencers, because literally speaking, they influenced a person. They helped a person. And these content creators will say that you get just one of those that makes it all worth it, makes all the challenges worth it. So in a sense, it is possible for a person to regret who they were and then do stuff and then influence. It is possible, technically speaking. It is possible. But we don't really have an idea of consciously doing it. Now, the example I want to bring, and this is why it gets a little political, because this is kind of the other example. So the theism, anti-theism thing, I think, is a pretty solid example that you can find out in the world. The other is, I don't like politics. I am rather strange when it comes to of what government is and how people work, because I'm willing to admit certain things, like a concept of intellectual frugality. Intellectual frugality is when a person thinks on the things that they care about and that they need to care about, and they don't think about other things. And if they are backed into a corner to make decisions based on the things that they are intellectually frugally against, so stuff that's just not in their realm of expertise or interest, those decisions are going to be easy to manipulate, and they're just bad. It's a bad idea. And that's what politics is a huge amount of people who cannot give informed consent because they are not informed because of intellectual frugality, and their consent is being manipulated out of them. So I don't I have views of politics that are very anti-democratic in that sense. And it's a really awful, arrogant perspective to have, which is why I don't like entertaining it or talking about it or anything like that. Because I'm included in the class of people I wouldn't really trust to vote. Like, what do I know about things? But I do think a little bit about some of these topics, nothing specific, which is why I kind of recuse myself of making any kind of political commentary that has any relevance or whatever. There's some universal things that I can talk about because, you know, I've been alive for a while and I understand a lot of this stuff. There's a phrase, and it's American, and it goes something like, if you're young and you're not a Democrat, you have no heart. And if you're old and you're not a Republican, then you have no brain. And that is a description of whether or not that's true. That is a description of the kind of timeline of regret. And you can imagine a person that's a rabid X who changes. And again, we're not talking about growth or improvement, just change, where they might have a political perspective, because we're talking in terms of that. They might have had one political perspective, time passes, they have a different political perspective. Those are antagonistic. They performed things in the past. They sent out ripples of what at the time was good faith, and they regret it after the fact. But now, what mechanism does a person have in terms of, well, they're going to be intellectually frugal about it, or they're going to be essentially a coward in even facing the fact that they were like that, let alone admitting it in public, let alone doing anything, let alone that being effective at all. And you end up having like severed friendships over, like, politics is one of the things that you really shouldn't be discussing with your friends. Or, I mean, people being mature enough to actually discuss politics by discussing politics, like, those people are rare, and you'll break friendships experimenting with that idea, because often you don't know why you think the things you do. You're often just parroting, you're quoting other people, and you don't know how to actually argue it, and you don't really fully know how to articulate the apologetics that will relay perspectives to somebody else, and vice versa. Like, the other person doesn't have the listening skills necessarily. And there's all kinds of topics you can talk about. And unfortunately, primarily, it's in American politics that Canada thinks about. I'm Canadian and I'm in Canada, and there's several different debates. They're really easy to solve, but trying to explain to people, they can't comprehend the world from the perspective of the other person. So one is the abortion topic, maybe another one is the gun topic, and you can bring up all kinds of stuff, and there's just a rift in a very specific axis of personality traits that makes it predictable what a person's opinions on all kinds of topics are just going to be. You can predict a person's politics, you can predict opinions on all kinds of social subjects and all this kind of stuff. It's amusing as hell to look at that kind of stuff. But you can imagine a person who goes from one perspective to the other perspective now has no heroes to emulate, to try to act out in the world, to not just have a new kind of goodwill that spreads forth with this now presumably to them better perspective. They don't have the ability to reach back and make up, to apologize for all the damage that they've created with a perspective that they now are antagonistic to. Like there's no concept of doing that. I think I've pretty much, I mean, the idea is being anti-nice. That was my note to jog my memory for this topic was anti-nice and the politics of no take-backsies. And I have no idea what I really meant by that, but hopefully I danced around the topic well enough. And it's becoming ever more of a problem from an archivist perspective. It's becoming ever more of a problem when people play pretend that something that is indelible, like a video, maybe that person is expressing perspectives in the past, that's like this indelible thing, that when a person changes their mind, somehow they're beholden to this old thing, that old person. You're not who you were yesterday. And if you change your mind, even if it's gradually, there are people who will attach something that you did, that you said 10 years ago. Like 10 years is a very long time. And it's especially people who are particularly young will like point at, you said this other thing, you voted this way, you argued this way, you did this and this. Now you're different. You're a hypocrite. It's like, kiddo, 10 years ago, you were in diapers. What are you talking about? You changed a lot. You don't remember the amount of changes you had. Like, okay, great. You're just out of college. This is your first job. This is your first career. And you think you understand anything about anything. You know how you've changed over the last 10 years. Can't you imagine how much you're going to change in the next 10 years? Can't you imagine how much pain, how much understanding you're going to get in the next 10 years? You're going to regret something about who you are right now, even if it's some bad habit, like that bit of junk food you still eat, that if you stopped 10 years ago, you would have been better now. Well, if you choose to stop now, to stop some bad habit, in 10 years, you're gonna hopefully be proud of yourself, but you're also gonna regret who you were in the past. But it's not gonna matter. Your old self is not gonna feel hurt or anything like that. But the damage is done back there, and people who look at that past version of yourself should also see should also feel understanding for your change, and hopefully you can help bring them to have part of you undoing the damage that you might have caused in the past might be taking people right now and helping them also be proud of you having changed and helping them change as well. But there's got to be more, and we just don't have enough examples of it, and they're not common enough, and they're not effective enough. And now I remember the entire huge rant of what I was going to talk about in terms of undoing damage. And it's so political that it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it does definitely have to do with that the youth versus the elderly, the efficacy of the ill-informed, manipulated consent of the youth versus the more patient, understanding, better choices of the older people, and how there are different politics involved, clumping just slightly, for all it matters, but more than slightly, by age. So you get decisions over here based on certain demographics, and then you get decisions over here based on certain demographics. And the damage that's done in the past by that demographic, as they get older, they'll change their mind, but they won't undo any of the damage. And there needs to be balance between the two, because you got to live with one another. You got to live with your kids, even if your kids are in their 20s. So you got to live in harmony. But if every youthful generation has an ever has a greater impact than all of the old people that just don't get it, they're out of touch, then when those people grow up and change their minds, as is for at least some things is going to be inevitable, that means that every successive generation is going to have more and more and more stuff created by youths who thought a certain way, who acted a certain way, who created a huge mess. And every adult, every child who grows up, every youth who grows up, will have more and more of the oppression of the young and that kind of mindset to suffer under. And because far too few of the current selves do nothing to undo the damage of their past selves, you get more and more people who do that. You get more past selves accumulating more bad decisions. Let's say, because you can imagine somebody who's young and naive and being taken advantage of. You get the decisions of more young and naive people having been taken advantage of, and all those people as they get older, imagining the best of them, they become less naive and they make good decisions. They could regret who they were, but they'll never undo their damage. So you get this constant, ever increasing pile of madness from the naive being taken advantage of. And that's one of the problems with having, in politics, that's one of the problems of giving the vote to the naive. I think so, giving the vote to people who can't have informed consent, either due to intellectual frugality, their disinterest, their ignorance, their innocence. Okay. So I've talked about that far too long, more than a half an hour. So I think I touched on everything. So how do we not just grow, learn, be open to experiences, to maybe learn from some of the mistakes that we're making now, to make it so that it isn't just change, it's improvement, and at the same time, maybe lay the groundwork now, or maybe somehow become bold enough in the future so that our future self can recognize and admit to and actually effectively undo the damage that we're currently doing. How do we imagine ourselves in the world right now? How would you think if many of the actions that you're performing right now, you're going to regret and are going to be wrong? How would you do things differently such that you can renege on everything as a way of hopefully being able to undo the damage of even just a few of those things? Imagining that most of the stuff you're going to do right now is positive. How would you hold the keystone for every single one of those things, so that if you happen to identify something in there that needs it, you can pull that keystone out and collapse that bridge for some stupid thing that you're doing right now? How do we think like that? How do we think of ourselves like that? What mechanisms do we have in place other than every once in a while we have to burn all of the bridges of all of the past youths, of all of our past selves, and just kind of do it over again? How do we even do that? Right. Lots of food for thought, I suppose. Maybe it's an unsolvable problem. So it's out there in the world, and I'm sure I'll regret making this video maybe tomorrow.